Hey guys, welcome back to the Bad Chinese Teacher Podcast. This is Patricia. I hope you've been doing well and you've been having a good week. It's been an interesting week throughout the world for a litany of reasons. It's been an interesting week for me personally as well, but I think there was one thing that's been happening in the world that I felt was somewhat relevant to this podcast and is probably on the minds of like basically everyone. It's really funny because one of my students came in a couple of days ago to class being like, Miss Liu, I need to go out and buy surgical masks, which is a funny thing. If you're not living in an Asian country, walking around with surgical masks when you're sick is not really like a thing. In Asia, basically, if you have like a cold, a cough or whatever, it's like generally considered like common courtesy to wear a surgical mask. So when you go out in public so that you don't like spread your germs everywhere. In the US, we don't really have that kind of cultural practice. Usually, like, if you go out and you're wearing a surgical mask because you're sick, you basically kind of look like a psychopath. So my student, who's like not Chinese, who's not Asian, comes in and is like, Miss Liu, I need to go out and buy surgical masks. And I'm like, why? And he's like, coronavirus. Which is funny because, like, you know, number one, I think I should preface this by saying that like schools are a cesspool of germs and viruses and illness and sickness, and so it's not to say that his concern is unwarranted. We have, you know, to commend my school a bit, we've taken measures to like, you know, make sure that things are sanitized. There's like hand sanitizer stations that were put up around the school. Yeah, it's like a lot of kids a lot of humans in one place. A lot of those humans are like children who like don't understand hygiene as well as they should. And so, yeah, schools are like not the cleanest place to be especially when you're worried about like, you know, especially like, I mean, flu season as a whole is like kind of, school's not a great place to be during flu season. So his concern is not unwarranted, but I think his reaction to the coronavirus is not really unique. So basically the coronavirus, if you've been living not on this planet for the past, you know, month, is a flu-like sickness that originated in China, and has kind of spread exponentially. So I'm recording this February 2nd, and so I know these numbers are going to be outdated by the time this episode is published tomorrow, February 3rd. But as of today, there have been about 14,557 confirmed cases of the coronavirus, the vast majority of those being in China. Of those, there have been 304 deaths, and just yesterday or 2 days ago, the first death outside of China was confirmed in the Philippines. And so besides that, about 23 countries have had documented cases of the coronavirus, including the United States. And I think just yesterday, the first case of coronavirus was reported in Boston. I think in the U.S., they've mostly been limited to, I think there's a case in Washington, there's one in Chicago, first East Coast case, which is close to where I live. And so I'm not going to lie, you know, I think in the U.S., we've kind of like, I mean, media travels fast, but I think whenever these like, you know, you could say the same about Ebola and, you know, other things, but we tend to be very like protected, to be honest. And so all of these like World Health global crises things tend to be somewhat abstract for, I think, a lot of people. And then all of a sudden, right, like it shows up like 2.5 hours away from where I live. And so, you know, it's not to say that like I'm not panicking, but I think the emotional first reaction I had, when I was like, oh shoot, that's like really close. I was like somewhat embarrassed for myself. Number one, knowing that the coronavirus, like scientifically speaking, you know, I'm not a scientific source, obviously, but the coronavirus, from, you know, what I've read and seen, is like not as bad as like your regular flu. It's novel, it's new, it spreads very quickly, and it's had a lot of media attention. But, you know, to be honest, if you're living really anywhere during this time of year, like you should probably be more concerned about getting your regular flu shot than getting coronavirus. But all that is to say is that the fact that like I consider myself to be, at least, you know, on good days, a fairly reasonable person. The fact that I had like a little bit of that like visceral sort of like, oh no, reaction to this is telling in that, like, obviously this disease, this pandemic has been a topic of concern and on the minds of many, and has received a ton of media coverage. And the thing about media coverage, especially in this day and age, I don't want to be like that, like old boomer who's like, these days the internet ruins everything. But I think one of the things that I see amongst people who are connected, I'd say, is that like the more information input you get, and the more you kind of live in an era where like you have the platform to express your opinion on something. It's kind of like if you are made aware of something, there's this pressure to form a somewhat well thought out opinion on it. Otherwise, you seem really ignorant. And so there's just been a lot of like hot takes on coronavirus, which is funny because coronavirus at its very core is like it's a illness, but it affects humans, it affects societies, it affects people groups. And so one of the discussions that's come out of this whole pandemic is the fact that coronavirus originated in China, and the kind of like xenophobic sort of, the xenophobia and the reactions to said xenophobia that's come out of this, that I think has really been a big part of the discourse surrounding this this pandemic, which is kind of what I want to talk about today. And so, I mean, I think to be fair, I remember when SARS was a thing in 2003, I was 10 years old. I remember this only because I remember this. This is what a 10-year-old remembers, right? I remember this because the SARS pandemic broke out on my 10th birthday. So happy birthday, me. But I remember as like a kid when SARS came out. SARS was also a pandemic that originated in China. And even being 10 years old, I still remember like playing on the playground, chasing people. No, I wasn't doing the chasing, but like kids chasing each other around, like being like, you have SARS, I'm trying to like remember. I was in elementary school at this point, but I think it was more kind of like, from what I remember, it was more kind of like Asian kids being insensitive little jerks and being like, you have SARS, I have SARS, because like, kids are dumb. And so, but the thing is, like, the reason why I mentioned that is because, I think amidst all the discussion amongst us, like, grown-ups about how, this panic about the coronavirus has really prompted some, unsavory commentary against Chinese people, like xenophobic sort of stuff. I think on the one hand, when I read that, I was a little skeptical. I was skeptical about like the breadth and the severity of the xenophobia being, elicited out of this pandemic, mostly because I hadn't seen it myself personally. But then I looked at my environment for the past like month, and I was like, who have I talked to in the past month? I've talked to my students, who are under the age of 18, and, some are aware of global issues, some are not. And then folks at like my very woke church. And so and then like other Chinese people, right? And so the opportunity to run into xenophobic jerks who are going to be like, get away from me, Chinese looking person, relatively low. And so, just because I haven't experienced it personally, I chalk that up to the fact that like I haven't interacted with some fantastically racist people. And so that's not necessarily representative of reality. And so when other people are saying that they're experiencing xenophobia as a result of this, I'm inclined to believe them. But at the same time, right, I'm coming at this, I'm like recording this podcast episode about xenophobia, and the coronavirus, having not experienced any of it firsthand myself. And yet I believe it's happening. And even if it's not happening in like spades firsthand to like Asian people everywhere, I think it still merits a discussion about, I don't want to go too deep into the history of, how Chinese people in the U.S. have been perceived as being, unclean or whatever. Like you can think back to like, this is like the 1800s when first Chinese immigrants came, and like kind of the neighborhoods that Chinese people were living in were seen as like rat infested, unsanitary places. The fact that mental image is what conjures up in my mind right now is kind of depressing, because it basically means that this stereotype, which is a very dehumanizing, very unreasonable, very not founded in reality, very, very racist stereotype, has persisted for like 100, 25 years, right? You would think that we'd do better by now, but it's nothing quite like fear stokes up irrationality amongst people. And I think one of the things you'll find about this coronavirus things from people who are saying some unsavory things, it's really, their rationale for saying and thinking the things that they are is really just kind of like, well, my personal safety is at risk, right? You can never be too cautious. If a couple people, if 1.4 billion people have to suffer because of it, then so be it. And so I think what's really interesting is not as much about like pointing out, it's like, oh man, here are all the racist, terrible things that these terrible racist people are saying. But really, to dig deeper into like, okay, you feel these things, people feel these things. Maybe they don't know, maybe they know that it's not right to think that way, and yet they still feel it and they're still going to act accordingly. I feel like that's where a lot of like this like underhanded justification for racism comes in, this like quote unquote economic anxiety that puts certain individuals into office despite, their values on, I don't know, how other people should be treated, et cetera, et cetera. Let's not get too political here. But anyway, that said, I'm recording this and I'm also having not, no one's walking down to my house, like, painting things on my lawn being like, get out, Asian people, you're going to infect us all with the coronavirus. I haven't encountered that yet. I think if we did, that's like a really... Man, that'd be a good time to like reconsider whether or not I should be living in this country. So I hope that never happens. But I was just scrolling through Twitter. I'm not on Twitter often. Usually I'm on Twitter to like do that really awful thing where you're like, this thing is happening. Internet, tell me how I should feel about this. Raise your hand if you've done that before, because I have. It's a lazy way of thinking. But at the same time, though, a lot of these talking heads on Twitter are saying some really interesting things. So what we're going to do today, what I want to do today, in the absence of me experiencing directly the kind of xenophobia, xenophobia that has really actually become a part of like the mainstream discourse, like I feel like I've seen like a couple of publications from like the WHO, CDC about like, governmental international health organization bodies that have directly addressed the xenophobia as being like, here are the reasons why you shouldn't panic. Not necessarily, some of them maybe not calling it xenophobia by name, but being like, don't believe everything you see on the internet. So, this shows you that like the whole panic is something that is fairly widespread and is kind of a keystone part of us kind of like picking apart this phenomena. So what I did is I just typed into Twitter coronavirus racism, which I understand is a very self-selecting way of kind of filtering through tweets. If you just kind of type in hashtag coronavirus, I'm just like, there's just too much. And so what I understand is that like if by kind of typing in, kind of searching those terms, the vast majority of the tweets are going to be like, don't be racist against Chinese people. Which, again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, even through this podcast, because I feel like if you're someone who's listening to a language learning podcast about Chinese, you're not going to be racist towards Chinese people. But anyway, I think this is something that is just kind of worth kind of thinking about or spending some mental and emotional energy on. So let's dig into Twitter a little bit. So by the way, and so to kind of filter out, I'm not looking for like fringe opinions on this. So basically, I'm only just going to highlight tweets that I see that have like, let's say like at least 50 retweets, prioritizing those from like checkmark accounts. All right. So anyway, at Blair Imani says, in all caps, coronavirus is not an invitation for racism, starburst emoji, or whatever like the explosion emoji is. And all the replies are like, it is not. And yeah, of course. I think this is one of those things that like this was tweeted a day ago. And I think if you're like needing to say this, a month after the virus was kind of discovered, this is kind of like, I think one thing I want to dig into a little bit later is kind of like, how much of our sort of calling out the xenophobia on this is really just kind of shouting into an echo chamber. I feel like, I don't know, I have mixed feelings on this because I feel like I feel like we're going to run into this as I scroll through Twitter. a lot of the discussion about like, yeah, the reaction to the coronavirus is xenophobic and racist, is happening in kind of like an echo chamber. A lot of people who are talking about this already know that like you shouldn't like be racist towards Chinese people because of a virus. Um, I don't know. I think there's something about that like self-congratulatory sort of attitude towards like this online activism that doesn't really sit well with me. Feels a little counterproductive. But hey, the flip side to that is like the more that people emphasize how unacceptable it is, it does change the discourse. And so, hey, if Caps Lock by at Blair Imani, makes it clear to someone how not okay it is, then hey, cool. This is interesting. At Maxime Bernier, which I guess is some political party leader in Canada, he's reacting to an article which I think is quoting Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada, our title of the article says, the Prime Minister warns against discrimination at Lunar New Year event as fears of coronavirus spread. And the guy says, quote, hey, blackface Prime Minister, instead of exploiting this crisis for political games by accusing Canadians of racism, as you did for weeks after the Christchurch massacre, why don't you focus on taking the appropriate measures to avoid the spread of the virus? So this is kind of funny because, like, basically this guy, I'm basically, paraphrasing, but seems like he's saying, like, again, this, I think the term virtue signaling is going to be popping up quite a bit on the, like, sort of, negative sort of reactions to the calling out of racism vis-a-vis the coronavirus. But basically this guy, I feel, is probably saying, like, hey, no one's actually, being racist towards Chinese people when it comes to the coronavirus. So why are you, Mr. Trudeau, spending so much time trying to call out these, like, metaphorical straw men, and why don't you focus on protecting our people instead? Which I think is an interesting take. What's on my mind, I'm like the last person on earth to have seen this commercial, but like, do y'all remember like the Gillette razor commercial that came out like I think a year ago? So I saw that commercial for the first time last night. Yeah, I know I'm very, very late on this, but I watched it. I didn't know that was the commercial. I just I think when it came out, I just like totally missed my radar. I never watched it. It somehow popped out last night, and then I just clicked on it, and then I started watching. I was like, oh, that's the commercial that everyone was so mad about. Watched it, and I was like, I don't understand why people were mad at this. I understand it's like a feminist commercial, and the only like my ill-informed hot take was like, I guess men don't like it when their brands get quote unquote hijacked for feminist means. Like, was that why? Went on to Reddit again, because I need the internet to tell me how to think. Went on to Reddit, and one of the threads on one of the like the Change My View subreddits was kind of like, talking about why someone would find this controversial. And basically the gist of it was kind of like, the people who are peeved at it were kind of like, why is this commercial assuming that men are terrible and sexist to begin with? Like, why are we being lectured at? And I think, again, let's talk about that a little bit. I think one thing that like us woke liberal people, when problematic things arise and like the Twitter world just starts kind of like canceling people left and right, I think the echo chamber I was talking about earlier is a phenomena that happens. I feel when you don't interact with enough people who don't share your ideological views. As someone who's worked in a space for the past 5 years that, that has a lot of people that, don't share a lot of ideological views with me. Number one, I enjoy being in that space because I think it's valuable. I think it's a good exercise to be around people that challenge you in meaningful ways, right? I think there is a temptation, particularly, and I think this temptation, this allowance is permissible, is understandable if you're, a person who has to deal with dealing with racism, sexism, homophobia on a day-to-day, and you just don't want to have to like sit around people who exacerbate that for you. I get that. But I've found my experience to be amongst people who disagree with me to be very valuable, because the thing it's taught me is as strongly and as I feel about my convictions about a certain matter, I can't, it's not productive or healthy to kind of sit in those convictions and feel like you're a good person, and surround yourself with like-minded people who can also like, validate your status as a good person constantly, right? I feel like that's what a lot of these Twitter threads end up being. Like you say one thing in caps lock, saying like racism bad, and everyone's like, yeah, racism bad. And then like so all of a sudden, like, this Maxime Bernier comes up to you and is like, hey, we never said anything about being racist. Why are you calling us racist? And then like, where does the conversation go after that, right? And so I think it's valuable to consider that as as a valid response to people saying that, the xenophobia surrounding the coronavirus is a huge deal, right? Are there really that many people out there like slamming Chinese people back and forth about how Chinese people are dirty and infected and need to be quarantined, blah, 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 right? Is the racism really that insidious, or are we kind of like anticipating that and xenophobia, and then kind of getting our, good person, filling our good person quota before the storm even hits? Not to say that, like, again, like being proactive and being like, hey, this has the potential to like raise some really racist and terrible, like, hot takes on things. I think, yeah, it's fine. I think it's good to kind of like raise that discussion first. I think the discussion around coronavirus has benefited from people kind of bringing that into the discussion, making it central to how we perceive what's going on around us. But at the same time, right, I don't think it's useful to be like, to say, hey, racists, like, stop being racist, and then people are like, who, us? Like, we haven't said anything yet. That sense of defensiveness, I think, coming from folks who like, who us woke people are like targeting without having really been attacked, I think that's a valid sort of defensive response. And so I think it's important to kind of like, acknowledge that for a little bit. And I think when you have, I don't think, looking at, again, this one tweet that I'm spending way too much time talking about, I don't think Prime Minister Trudeau said anything wrong. But I think given the general political, social discourse surrounding, internet wokeness, this guy's reaction, I don't think is unique. Again, thinking back to that Gillette commercial where people were like, how could you possibly find this offensive? It's really sort of like, if you're someone who is a person of privilege and you're just trying to, you've been trying your best to not be a bad person, and then like people left and right keep telling you, hey, you privileged jerk, like, behave, it does get, if you're just a regular Joe, like I can imagine how that can get kind of exhausting. I think it takes a real position of humility to be able to constantly take that feedback, right? And humility is a necessary and a good thing, and more people should practice it. But the reality is that like none of us are really as humble as we should be. And so I don't know. I'm not doing a good job of diagnosing the situation, but I think that's just a really interesting dynamic, right? I think in the minds of us like woke folks, we're just kind of like shout into Twitter being like, boo racism, and then we expect for like the so-called to be racist to look at our tweets and be like, oh, wait, maybe we shouldn't be racist. I don't think that ever really happens. And so, to be able to look at those interactions and face the reality that like, people who have a different opinion from us, ill-informed or otherwise, are going to feel defensive if they're constantly being like chided for things that they don't feel like that they're guilty of. Speaking of which, let's continue. This tweet has exactly 51 retweets, but I thought it was interesting and had a lot to say. So Maggie_Bray says, if you're white, kindly, and I think judging by her profile picture, she is also white, but she says, if you're white, kindly shut the F up about the coronavirus, the Chinese government, the dog eating festival, or any effed up justification of racism towards Chinese and Asian people. Did you conveniently forget about how white people transfer diseases to indigenous people? So, or it continues, thread. Or how about we intentionally killed bison to near extinction simply to starve out the Native Americans and never made any use out of the animals? Or are you not aware of the 800,000 cows we slaughter each day, 4 million pigs, 137 million chickens, and the pollution from it? Cruelty has no race and no nationality. I do not condone the exotic animal trade, and I think it's something that absolutely should be advocated against. But if you can do that, you can't do that without being a bigot. Shut the F up. Okay. Cool. Yeah. I mean, okay, I'll say this. White allies who stick up for people of color, I think that's a cool thing. It's a necessary thing, I've actually realized. One of the things that I remember talking with a colleague when we first started diversity work at our school was kind of like, on the one hand, you know, in an ideal world, this work is a place where people of color, women of color, which we both were, ought to be elevated and are, you know, like leadership to be taken seriously. But what we quickly realized is that, like, in reality, in order to have really any sort of, you know, credibility about doing like anti-racist work, it's really easy to be viewed as like an angry woman of color with a bone to pick unless you have some white man usually who is willing to kind of stand alongside you and say like, hey, yeah, these guys are right. Like they, you know, given that sort of visual picture, what people will see is that like, you know, the white dude has an objective look at it and is not emotionally compromised, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of messed up. But I remember my colleague and I having this conversation being like, yo, if we want to get things to work, this is kind of like how people work. And so, I mean, you could say that, like, you know, this white girl who is tweeting a storm about the coronavirus and talking about, you know, animal cruelty, whatever. I mean, given, again, like, how cancel culture is, you could be like, yo, why are you talking so much? Why aren't you just retweeting Asian people? Like, why are you taking up room, right? But at the same time, I'm just like, hey, someone's listening to her. Like, 51 people retweeted her. Cool. Yeah, fine. Thank you. That being said, I think it's interesting exactly what she's calling out. There's two layers to this. So the first part about being like, you know, if you're white, kindly shut the F up about the coronavirus, the Chinese government, the dog eating festival, or any effed up justification of racism towards Chinese and Asian people. Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening here is kind of like if you're outside of this Chinese culture and you're making judgment calls against anything that Chinese people, the Chinese government as well, is doing about, or had a hand in, I don't know, like causing the coronavirus to happen. I'm talking about like the wet markets, that's where the coronavirus was sourced from. Basically, she's saying, don't be a hypocrite. White people throughout their history have done similar things in terms of like infecting, in her example was indigenous people, Native Americans with disease. Basically saying don't be a hypocrite because white folks, American folks have done the same thing before. And what, the origins of the coronavirus being, from China is not an excuse for you to kind of cast judgment on these cultural things, cultural practices, political practices as well. I think, yeah, good, because, I think this is something that, like, the comparisons between, like, why are Westerners sort of easily jumping onto the anti-Chinese bandwagon about, like, oh, this coronavirus happened because Chinese people are unsanitary and uncultured and uncivilized and eat dogs and eat rats and blah, 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 to the comparisons between like, oh, but also like a lot of Westerners don't vaccinate their children voluntarily, as well as like the whole Native American smallpox thing. It's I think, on one level, I think that is a, good thing to kind of insert into the dialogue. That being said, I think also if you're seeing this, right, and you're saying like, don't criticize the way that Chinese people have their cultural practices, don't criticize the government, don't criticize anything. I think it's not as if, like, on the one hand, right, the paranoia and the myth finding about how the virus is a uniquely Chinese phenomenon connected to, Chinese people's the perception of Chinese people as being unsanitary and uncivilized. That's one thing. But I think at the same time, no people group is perfect. Chinese people themselves have talked about like those wet markets and being like, yeah, maybe we should like not not have those. And so, it's one thing to be like, if you're an outsider, be careful about making judgment calls, and be careful to be aware of where your own cultural, identity center is and what position you're talking about another culture from and what kind of value judgments you're making as a result of your own personal biases. At the same time, right, again, no people group, no government is perfect. And there have been some really valid criticisms about both the cultural practices, surrounding whatever, like the wet markets that the virus came from, as well as, I think to a great extent, this is probably more legitimate of a criticism, Chinese government's reaction to a lot of these things. A lot of people are drawing comparisons between how the Chinese government handled SARS and how a lot of the severity of it was underplayed, et cetera, et cetera. It's complicated, I think. And I think, again, to reduce this analysis of the situation to a set of hot takes, and to be like, hey, if you're white, don't criticize anything that maybe criticism being one thing I've learned I've learned as I've grown into pretend adulthood is kind of realizing where my voice is necessary and where am I the one, is it necessary for me to say something, is it necessary for me to say it. I think that's a good piece of advice for everyone. But at the same time, right, that doesn't prevent you from thinking critically about something. And so, just because people are saying this, don't feel like you have to sort of, in your minds, paint the Chinese government as blameless. Chinese people are not painting themselves as blameless and perfect throughout all of this. I think that's a very, very dangerous thing to do for any situation. But yeah, think more critically. Look for the facts. Don't be afraid of diving into the intricacies and the complexities of the situation. All right, let's continue. All right, I apologize for the sniffling. I have a cold, which feels ironic given the topic matter of today's podcast. All right, at Trang and Dong says, you're more likely to die from the flu than coronavirus, so go to CVS and get your flu shot and stop using an illness you're unlikely to get to justify racism towards Asian people. Yes, go get your flu shot, guys. She continues, there are around 5 reported cases of coronavirus in the U.S. and none of them have died, whereas thousands of people have been hospitalized or died from the flu. Get your vaccines. Get your vaccines, guys. Just keep things in perspective. Get your flu shot. This is interesting. This is like a meme. If you define meme as some internet picture that has been passed around virally. Probably some of you have seen this. I'll put this up in the show notes so you can be reminded of what it looks like, because I'm pretty sure most of you have seen this. It's like a myths and facts T-chart about the coronavirus, which really kind of sums up a lot of the, I don't know, maybe oversimplifies this, but it kind of compares some of the myth, or really just kind of emotional assumptions that people are making about the coronavirus and then what is actually happening. So, out of an obligation to, as I'm talking about the coronavirus, to actually lay out what people are thinking, what the actual facts are. Let's take a look at this. So, myth. Corona is the most dangerous virus that exists. Fact. The common flu kills 60 times more people annually than corona. Yes, get your flu shot. Myth. I will die if I am diagnosed with the coronavirus. Fact. Only 2% of cases have reported deaths, and most of these deaths were associated with weaker immune systems, e.g. old age. Myth. I need to buy a hazmat suit and an N95 mask to stay protected. Fact. Washing hands and sneezing into elbows is the best practice. Myth. We all need to panic and blame China for this emergency. I should also make insensitive jokes about international students. That's hilarious. Fact. The panic and hysteria that's happening is fueled by racism and xenophobia, not evidence and practicality. Nothing justifies being rude to others. Indeed. Myth. I should believe everything I read online about coronavirus because it is all factually checked and written without any bias. Fact. Misinformation and racism is more dangerous than any virus. Check for references and look for evidence, not ideology. I mean, true. All true. I don't know if this is really going to stop people from just reading, again, one factoid on Facebook, one meme on Facebook, and just spreading it to their friends and believing it. But hopefully the fact that this little meme is spread around is helping people to think twice. Again, the benefit I feel about making xenophobia a part of the conversation surrounding coronavirus. It's not as much, again, because the xenophobia is really that rampant, but I think it's important, again, to again, with some health related sort of issue. I think it's really easy for people to, or really safety related issue. I think it's really easy to kind of throw the personhood of people out completely and be like, these people are, whether they're because coronavirus, because terrorism, because whatever, what have you. It's really easy for people to kind of throw out the humanity of those people and be like, well, I got to take care of me and my safety. And, reducing the personhood of someone because I am scared is a justifiable and understandable reaction right now. I think people are going to have that reaction nonetheless. But again, the benefit I feel of having, racism and xenophobia be a part of the conversation, it causes people to, it puts that at the forefront of people's minds and forces people to think twice, which is good. All right, let's continue. Tweets with more than 50 retweets. Okay. Nancy Wang Yuan, at Nancy Wang Yuan, her handle is Nancy Y Yuan. She says, I find myself washing my hands more and not sharing food because I worry that if I catch a cold, people will assume it's the coronavirus. Yes, I am more concerned about racism than catching the actual coronavirus. Yeah. I mean, I wonder where she's at, where she's based out of, for this to be a concern. But, she's obviously an Asian person. But I don't know. I feel like given if I had enough negative interactions with people that, maybe even mirror what happened during SARS, what I remember of that as a kid, I could see myself doing this. It'll be interesting. I mean, the cold that I have right now just came up today. So, little sociological experiment. Let's see what happens. But I think this is actually one thing that is worth talking about. This idea of I'm sure that this person knows that you shouldn't have to capitulate to people's racism and fears, and yet to make your life a little more bearable, to make it a little easier, you do these things, right? Again, she says she washes her hands more, doesn't share food because she's scared that if, she catches a cold, she gets sick, people are gonna give her a hard time about it. It's not as much I want to be safe because I don't want to get sick. It's if I get sick, then I'll be, the detriment of someone being racist towards me and making my life difficult is matters more to me, has a more negative effect to me than actually getting sick. And I think if you're someone who's never experienced that sort of fear before, I think, if you're talking about this from a position of privilege, you're looking at that and be like, yo, you shouldn't have to do that, right? You shouldn't have to live in fear. I've gotten that reaction a lot of if I'm asked to tell stories about things I've done to protect myself, at the cost of what feels like my own dignity, so as to preemptively, prevents people being racist and intolerable towards me. Got a lot of really well-meaning white people being like, yo, you shouldn't have to do that. And I'm like, I know, but I do it anyway. I'm sure women do this a lot. I will say this, women do this a lot. Don't go out at night because you're going to get robbed. You're going to get raped. Don't walk where there's streetlights. Don't go out in certain places. I've had men being like, why are you so worried about this? You shouldn't have to worry about it. And I'm just like, yeah, I shouldn't, but I do. And so my life has to change because of it, and I have to make choices because of that. And it doesn't matter that it's not my fault that I have to worry about these things. It's not my fault that I have a potential to be hurt because of this, but that's just a part of living while woman. And it's really unfortunate. And I think, it's one of those things that is really easily taken advantage of by other people, in order to justify, not needing to change what's happening in our society, right? It's kind of oh, as long as women, protect themselves, right? Don't go out late at night, or like, carry pepper spray, whatever. As long as women take those measures, then like there's no need to really change anything, our comfortable state. And it's like, no, like we're not living full lives because of these allowances that we're making just so we can like survive. And so I mentioned that because you see this phenomena here as well. Like, I can imagine like as an Asian person, I don't know, having to behave in a certain way so that you don't make other people feel uncomfortable. Because really, this is what that is, right? People, because of this coronavirus, feel uncomfortable, for lack of a better term, around Asian people. And if you're Asian or you're Chinese and you just want to live your life, right? Like, you don't want people to feel uncomfortable because of you. And so, like, you're going to be, because you're nice, you're going to be proactive and, like, make them feel comfortable around you. Like, stuff like that. Like, things being asked, I don't know, I can see this happening, like someone asking me like, oh, we're in China recently. I'm like, no, I haven't been in China. I've been to China once in my life. I'm Taiwanese. I feel like that's like one thing I do want to talk about this, like maybe it'll come up later up, but like the wanting to separate yourself from anything Chinese, so that you can kind of not feel responsible to carrying that cultural, that social baggage of being Chinese under this threat of coronavirus. I think I've been seeing like Taiwanese people sort of like really emphasizing that they are not Chinese. This tends to happen amongst Taiwanese people whenever China does something unsavory or something unsavory. Like, people have a reason to hate on China. Taiwanese people, I feel, are one of the first to be like, hey, that's not us. Which is, I think, maybe fair, but also like kind of tacky. But anyway, that's another topic for another time. All right, let's keep scrolling through Twitter. All right, this is good. At Doc Schmadia tweeted, today my son was cornered at school by kids who wanted to test him for coronavirus just because he is half Chinese. They chased him, scared him, and made him cry. I was the same age when I was bullied for being Pakistani. It's 2020. I thought things had changed by now. And then later on, she posted an update. She says, update. My son is okay. Confused, but okay. A Chinese friend and his brother were also targeted. This morning, we talked about what racism is. I will talk to the principal. There is hope for education, perspective, and compassion. Here's to making a better world. Another update. Spoke to the principal. She apologized. By then, she had learned of similar incidents in other classes. She immediately informed relevant parties and went to each class in each grade to talk about racism, coronavirus, and compassion. This is leadership in action. I'm grateful for the support and overwhelmed by the response to the tweet. I'm so sorry that I won't be responsible, blah, blah, blah. More than that, I'm struck by the stories from others of racism experienced in the Ebola crisis, the SARS crisis. Now, this is real. Yeah. So this is why, like, again, I haven't personally experienced, any xenophobic, unsavory comments, as a ethnically Chinese person as a result to this, but people are saying that it's happening to them. People are saying it's happening to their children. I'm not inclined to doubt them. Again, because I remember what happened during SARS. As a 10-year-old kid, you don't remember much, but the reason why I feel like that memory is like a valid piece of evidence is because SARS, I remember distinctly identifying SARS in its link with China, like SARS equals China. And you don't draw that connection between a disease and a people group at the age of 10 unless someone else helps make that connection for you, usually in negative ways, because that's what we remember. And so, the principal sounds like a baller. That's really cool. I imagine this is like probably an elementary school. One thing that like has always just been an interesting topic when it comes to education and social justice is how early do you start talking about racism and other sensitive things to children? Like, how early is too early? Do we it's a serious topic, obviously, and it surrounds itself with events and, historical or current that are, I don't know, not exactly, the topic of G-rated movies, right? Do you tell a 6-year-old, how do you talk about police brutality against Black folks to a kindergartner? Do you? One thing, though, I think, which I think makes this principle, in my experience, very brave, to be as straightforward and proactive and having a direct hand in talking about racism vis-a-vis the coronavirus, not just like this sort of milquetoast, everyone be nice to each other, have respect, which I think, is good, but ends up being kind of like just indirect enough for people to not feel like, again, the xenophobic comments, that are born out of a fear, fear or wanting to self-protect, feeling that those are permissible as a result, that those are not disrespectful. So I think props to this principle for bringing the racism component of that up, because really that's what it is, right? Kids, number one, kids repeat what they hear, and so if a child who has had that connection again drawn for them between coronavirus and Chinese people, and that being a negative connection, they're just going to go and spout that at school whenever they see a Chinese person. This was that phenomena of non-Chinese kids at my school growing up, knowing things about Chinese people secondhand that were oftentimes false and racist, and then seeing me as an actual Chinese person, and then, it's like seeing a zoo animal, certain things about zebras or whatever, and then you go to the zoo, see an actual zebra, and it's like, oh wow, everything that all the secondhand information I knew about zebras, I'm gonna share right now. Whether I don't know, I'm using zebras as an example, but you know what I mean. And so, stuff like that. I think this is, it's easy to look at the story and be like, man, these kids are terrible. This racism is affecting children. Yes, all true. But also, I believe it's easy to look at this and be like, oh, if you're a skeptic, right? Also to be like, man, this person is using their child as a way to get retweets or whatever. No, this stuff actually happens. I remember this happening. This is whenever things, racist things happen, and then people are like, nah, people can't possibly be that awful. A lot of the times, my rebuttal to that is no, I know this is the thing that happens because what they're describing, the subtext of this, I've experienced before. It's hard to describe that subtext. It's hard to provide proof for that subtext, but it exists, and it's hurtful. And please believe us. And so, all that said, I think, again, it's good that this school really was proactive in really making sure that kids were aware of exactly how disrespectful, how uncompassionate, how unkind it is to do that, because, it's kids think it's fun, right? Kids see something and they think it's fun and they just kind of take to it. They don't know. They should know better, but they don't. And that's kind of the point of school, to learn and not be ignorant. All right, let's continue. At Shaylee Karan says, white people's racism and xenophobia around coronavirus is so effed up, LMAO. Your ancestors literally imported smallpox to North America and systematically decimated First Nations populations, but go off with your, quote, can't trust Asian person coughing next to me in the library. Coronavirus is affecting Chinese people, and the travel advisories kept families apart during their most important holiday. But imagine this, thinking this is about you and you only. Grow up. Yeah, interesting way of framing it, because I feel people teenagers maybe, but a lot of people like to be edgy with their jokes. I feel like this is maybe a lot of the xenophobia, the quote unquote xenophobia that we're seeing, particularly around amongst young people that maybe should know better, is really just kind of this edgy joke making, this kind of yeah, right. And so maybe on the one hand, I think that's a lot of the time the kind of the hardest sort of conversations to really have to make those productive, because on the one hand, someone who's just saying, oh, don't sit next to international student who's coughing, on the one hand, people will be like, yo, it's just a joke, bro, not a big deal, just being edgy. And then the people who are reacting to that being like, that's racist, people will be like, why are you so sensitive? Yeah, as a person who works around teenagers who have a tendency towards edgy humor, what I've said to a lot of times when I've seen that is kind of number one, you're not as funny as you think you are. Number two, edgy humor is not as funny as you think it is. And then we get into do we see how this can be perceived, right? I think, a lot of the times people who make those jokes are just trying to get a reaction out of someone. We're an attention-seeking society. But I think, in my experience, right, it hasn't been super productive to kind of like call out those jokes without first kind of like meeting people where they're at. Because it's like, I think if someone who makes an edgy joke about like, coronavirus, they're not, the first thing they'll say to you is that like, well, I wasn't trying to be malicious. It's just a joke, blah, blah, blah. And I think trying to address exactly, what that joke making, where that joke making comes from, where that joke comes from is not necessarily like, oh, I'm a racist and I'm genuinely malicious towards like Asian people. It's just kind of like, okay, you really want attention that badly that you are willing to make a like, edgy, unfunny joke about it, right? Like, wow, it's kind of sad. Just disarming people that way, I think, for me, in my experience, has been more helpful than just sending them like a white paper on why, it's what you're saying is hashtag problematic. I feel like, I don't know. I mean, as I'm recording this, I realize that I run the risk of sounding very dismissive towards people's reaction towards the racism that has arose out of the virus. Yeah, I mean, I keep saying that I haven't encountered a lot of racism firsthand. I keep myself very protective, I guess. And so it's easy for me to say, yo, don't make up such a big deal out of this. Don't be so reactionary. To folks who have dealt with those reactions, those direct, malicious comments. And so I want to recognize that and be like, maybe my tune on this will change when someone like actually says something really awful to me personally about the coronavirus. But I think, coronavirus or not, I'm no stranger to people being microaggressive, or just straight up aggressive about race things, Chinese people things to me. It's kind of part of my job at times, to encounter those comments. And so if I'm a little desensitized to like microaggressions against Chinese people, like, I'm sorry, it's just something that I've dealt with so often that, I don't know, maybe I've just become like kind of numb to it. And so I don't want to downplay like the, the severity of what people are saying. I think a lot of what racism has turned into for me has just been kind of like figuring out coping mechanisms and learning to live my life without being overwhelmed by the barrage of little things that kind of end up on my doorstep, right? Learning how to deal with that. I feel like my weakest moments in life have been times where I've allowed those things to kind of consume me, right? And so a big part of my personal survival as a human has been kind of like, learning to grow a thicker skin, number one, but also learn to deal with, interact with these people in a productive way. I think the first stage, right, you could look at these microaggressions, instances of racism, and the first stage is to not let that break you, right? To be able to like, sometimes that looks like just shutting certain people out of your life and like, whatever, refusing to engage. That's a legitimate, I think, reaction sometimes. For me, I've also realized, for me, a lot of times that like shutting people out, refusing to engage is not really an option where I'm at. And so part of that coping process has also been, learning to confront, deal with those people in ways that are productive and also preserve the relationship. That I think is something that's just important to me personally. I'm not someone who really feels good about door slamming people because they're not as woke as I am. And that, in my experience in the past, has really panned out very poorly for me and cost me, people who I care about in life. And so personally, that's not an option for me. And so a lot of like my framing around these things feels weirdly mellowed out and maybe even a little bit, flippant and casual. But really, I think it's because of where I've come to at a place in life. That being said, I'm not saying that like my approach, my mindset towards these things is the best one, nor do I think that people should, this is more important, people should expect every person of color, every woman, to deal with oppression in the same way. That expectation, honestly, is a very unfair expectation. I do these things. I look at these things with a certain kind of lightness because I feel like I have to. And that takes a lot of work, to be honest, to be able to kind of like not let these things affect you. It takes a lot of active work. It's not a matter of like, oh, you just need to be a more patient, understanding person. It's like takes cognitive effort. And so I think as we're looking at, the coronavirus, number one, as a public health concern, again, please stay safe and please wash your hands and get your flu shot. But also as kind of like a socio-political sort of phenomena. The fact that racism and xenophobia is part of the conversation is not a result of people just being overly sensitive and wanting to make everything a conversation about race. Because people are like, those reactions, those xenophobic comments, it's actually a thing. Like people, just from scrolling through Twitter alone, like if people are saying that their children are being affected, I'm inclined to believe them, right? And I've had friends who live in different places from me and have said the same thing about their own personal experiences. I'm inclined to believe them as well. And I think, given from wherever you are at in terms of your opinions on this topic, whether you're someone who's just like, rah, racism, don't be racist, and I'm preaching to the choir, or you're someone who's just kind of like, I don't understand why people are virtue signaling about this. I think one thing that is a useful piece of advice to everyone is, someone is saying that they are negatively affected by someone's racist perception towards them, and are telling you and are being forward enough to share with you that story, please believe them, and please listen to them, and please empathize with how one microaggressive instance really speaks into a story that far stretches beyond someone just making an edgy, unfunny joke about international students coughing in the library, right? Please listen to people when they say that. But at the same time, again, as we're navigating through this, as I'm navigating through this in my classroom, I think, to tie this all back to education, mentioned in previous episodes that, my number one goal, the only reason why I feel that teaching Chinese is somewhat of a moral imperative for me, is because of that disconnect between English-speaking folks and Chinese-speaking folks. Part of the reason why things like this coronavirus, and then if you look at Ebola, the reason why there is a panic is because of how foreign each of those diseases are, because they come from places that seem just as foreign, and all of the information you're getting, if you don't speak those languages, if you don't interact with those people directly, is all secondhand, and secondhand information is how myths are born. And so, again, okay, I'm not saying that being bilingual will solve racism, but it definitely builds into, at least I hope for my students, a sense of empathy that stretches beyond just, this is foreign enough for me to make an edgy joke about it and for me to get away with it. You know what I mean? More knowledge creates nuance, and nuance creates empathy. And so, I think, as if you're a language teacher, if you're a Chinese teacher, and I think it's important to talk about current events like this, like the coronavirus, and because it impacts Chinese people, right? And I think as a world language teacher, one of our goals is to connect our students with real life people, real life culture, real life issues, and so this is one of them. And so to be able to kind of dig into those complexities, I think is a really worthwhile educational experience. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this timely and rambly episode. We are actually coming towards the end of this first season, so this is episode 16. We'll be taking a little break at episode 20 a couple weeks from now, but until then, there are some really fun things in store, and then maybe some fun things in store after that, even after the season is over. So please keep an ear and maybe even an eye out for that. Got some really fun things planned. So thanks to all of you who listen from week to week. If you like what you hear, please share this podcast with a friend. I'm always really surprised at how people manage to connect with what we're talking about here. Feels very niche sometimes, a lot of the topic matter, but niche is where it really hits at the heart sometimes. Sometimes you find someone who's just like, oh, never thought someone else thought like that before, never thought someone else had those same experiences, and that I love those moments. I think that's really special. So anyway, recommend this to a friend. Write me a review if you liked what you heard, so that I know exactly what you heard, so I can do more of that. If you haven't followed us on social media, you can go ahead and do that. On Instagram, we are at Bad Chinese Teacher. On Twitter, we are at Bad Chinese Pod. And on Facebook, just search up the name of the podcast. Show notes can be found at badchineseteacher.com. If you're looking for me, Patricia, you can find me on Instagram at Patricia Liu and at Twitter at Patricia SQ Liu. And you can find my latest writing at my blog at blog.patricialiu.net. All right, we'll be back again next week with some more of your favorite Chinese culture, educational, social, whatever content. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.